In this video, we're going to get this ball moving. Well, the first thing I want to do, I'm going to reset my composition magnification just to fit to 100% so I can see the entire composition. And what we're going to do is we're going to get this ball to move from this position, which will be the top of its bounce, down to the bottom of our composition, which will act like the floor. And this ball will bounce off the floor and then bounce back up. And that will be one cycle of its bounce. So from top to the floor and back up again. So that's what we're going to do. And to do that, we are going to use the position property and animate the position property. Now, how do we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to set a keyframe. Now, make sure that the ball that you are animating is at roughly about this part of your composition, sort of above the center line anyway. And what we're going to do is we are going to set a keyframe. And setting a keyframe is basically telling After Effects that at this point in time, you can see our current time indicator is at the very beginning of our timeline. It says at this point in time, we want this object to be in this position. And that's what we're going to do. Now, to do that, we just need to come down to our transform properties here. And you can see that there is a stopwatch beside all these properties. And all we have to do is click on that stopwatch and basically watch what happens to our timeline. Whoops, I'm going to do that again because I had both anchor point and position selected. I'm going to just do this for the position property. There we go. We have now set a keyframe, and you can see over here, just looks like this yellow diamond, and it's at the very beginning of our timeline. And like I say, that is telling After Effects that at this point in time we want this object to be right where it is. Well, what I'd like you to do is now to scrub your timeline, take your current time indicator and position it at exactly the 1 second mark. And you can see that this is advancing. As we get there, we are going to get to exactly 1 second. Now, if you're having a hard time getting it exactly on 1 second, if you would like, you can advance the current time indicator 1 frame forward or 1 frame back just by holding the command button and hitting the left arrow on your keyboard, and that'll bring it back in time, or the right arrow on your keyboard, that'll advance it 1 frame in time. Anyway, we are now at the 1 second point. So what we're going to do is we are going to make another keyframe. We're going to say that at this point, we would like this ball to be on the ground. Well, in order to get it there, we're going to use our selection tool up in our toolbar, and I'm going to just drag this ball straight down. And you can see what's happening. What is being created is its motion path, and it looks like a dotted line. And one thing to be aware of, we want this ball to fall straight down, and so in order to constrain its vertical axis, we're going to hold the shift button down, and that'll keep it falling straight down. If we didn't have that shift button pressed down, we could bring the ball over here, but then of course that wouldn't look like a ball falling. It would look like a ball moving off to the side. So I'm going to position that right there so it's touching pretty much close to the bottom of our. So I'm going to do that again just because I messed it up. There we go. And look what's happened. When we moved that ball at that point, a new keyframe was automatically created. And let's scrub our timeline and look what's happening. There we go. We have a ball that is actually falling, essentially falling until it hits the ground at that point. And like I said, we are going to create 1 cycle so that it falls, hits the ground, and then bounces back up. So we need to create 1 more keyframe. So we're going to scrub our current time indicator again and position it right at the 2 second mark. And so right there is the 2 second mark. And now we want to have this ball back where it started. Well, we could just take our arrow, our direction arrow, selection arrow, and move it back up. But we have that value already in this keyframe right here, the very first keyframe that we had created. And so what I'd like to do is I'm just going to select that keyframe so that it's yellow, and I'm going to hit Command C and copy it, and I'm going to paste it. And what happens, After Effects automatically pastes the keyframe that we just copied at exactly the position of the current time indicator. And right now we positioned it at 2 seconds. So when I hit Command V, you can see it's created that keyframe right there. We now have this cycle that we wanted, where the ball starts at the top, hits the ground, and then bounces back up to its starting point. And let's do something. Let's take a look and see how that runs in real time. I'm going to come over here to the right hand side of my screen, and there is a window here called Preview. And you can see this is your standard forward, backward, pause, play buttons. And I'm just going to hit the play button, and we're going to see how this works. And there you go. We have a ball that is bouncing. Now, one thing I want you to see here is that this red line is playing, and it's just playing within our work area. Remember, we set that work area in the last video. We set it just to about the 2-second mark there. And so all it's doing is it's playing to the end of that work area and then repeating itself. So it looks like the ball is bouncing, but essentially what we have is just this one cycle. All right, I'm going to stop that. I'm going to bring this back to the beginning. And what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to imagine what this ball would look like if it were in fact a rubber ball hitting the ground and then changing its shape a little bit. If right now this ball is not changing its shape, it's almost like a billiard ball. It's just like hitting the side of the wall and then bouncing right back. But our rubber ball effect is going to require a little bit of what's called squash and stretch. And so again, let's do a little thought experiment. As it is right now, our ball hits the ground and remains on the ground for exactly 1 frame and then starts bouncing back up. But if this were a real rubber ball, this ball would remain on the ground for more than just that 1 frame. It would actually hit the ground, stay on the ground, deform itself just a little bit, and then bounce back up. So what we'd like to do is we're going to change these keyframes so that the ball can remain on the ground for 5 frames. And what I'm going to do is I'd like to zoom in just a little bit here. You'll see that there's this little slider at the bottom of our timeline panel. I'm just going to slide it from the left position over to the right just a little bit. And you can see how this is allowing our timeline to expand a little bit so we can see this just a little bit better. There we go. That's something like that is just fine. So what I'd like to do is I want to create yet another keyframe of this position here where it's on the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that keyframe, Command C, and now I'm going to go back in time along our timeline 2 frames, and I'm going to paste that keyframe that we just copied. Remember, the easiest way to navigate just a couple of frames along our timeline is to hold the Command button down, and in this case I'm going to hit my left arrow twice. 1, 2. And you can see now that we're at frame 28. That's exactly where we want to be. And since we just copied this keyframe where it was on the ground, if I hit Command V, it's going to put a new keyframe in there, and now the ball is on the ground at that position, or at that time. You can see it hits the ground, and now it's going to stay there for a couple of frames, and then it's going to bounce up. But remember, we want this ball to be on the ground for 5 whole seconds, or 5 whole frames. So what we're going to do is now we're going to advance along our timeline to 1 second and 2 frames. And again, the best way to do that is to hold down the Command button and hit your right arrow twice, 1, 2, or however many it requires in order to get to this point here where it says 1 second, 2 frames. And again, I'm going to hit Command V to paste that keyframe so that that ball is now on the ground for 5 whole seconds. There we go. It stays down there for 5 frames. And now it bounces back up. So while it's on the ground for these 5 frames, now we can change its scale property and give it a sort of a squash and stretch effect. Now, the squash and stretch are old terms used by animators. They just basically describe the well, you'll see just what they describe in just a second. Now, what I want to do is, again, I want to position my current time indicator at the first of these keyframes right here at frame 28. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell After Effects that I want this ball to be in this scale position at that time, which is just as it hits the ground, I want it to maintain its round shape. So I'm going to say hit the stopwatch, and there is a new keyframe, and you can see that this is maintaining its shape. Now I'm going to advance 2 frames out, or 2 frames along my timeline. So I'm going to hit Command right arrow 1, 2. So I'm at exactly the 1 second mark. And at this point, we're going to start to see a deformation of this ball. And I'm going to squash it just a little bit. about 80% would be fine. But remember, this ball has a certain volume, and as it squishes along the y-axis, it's going to stretch along the x-axis. So we're going to have a corresponding stretch along this way, just so that it maintains its volume. And something around that that value, about 117 for its x and about 80% for its y, will maintain its volume. Now, if you wanted to, you could really exaggerate this. We could really take that out and make it look like it were almost pancaking down, and that would have a much more exaggerated effect. You can see what happens then as we scrub our timeline. It hits the ground, and rather than being like a rubber ball, it's almost like it's a water balloon hitting the ground. But we want this to, well, I mean, hey, if you want to have that sort of exaggeration, feel free to do that. The next thing that we want to do, though, is we would like to have this ball bounce back up in the air, and so it's going to have to regain its shape as it bounces back up. So in order to do that, and the easiest way to do that is, let's just copy this keyframe that we had when it hit the ground, when it was at 100%. I'm just going to select that keyframe for scale and go Command-C or copy it. And again, I'm just going to advance along my timeline, hold the Command button, hit the right arrow, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there we go. So it gets to that 0.2, or sorry, 1.02, 1 second, 2 frames. And I'm going to paste that keyframe in again. Okay. Well, let's scrub our timeline and see what happens here. So we now have a ball that falls from the top, hits the ground, really pancakes out, and then bounces back up.